Let's begin the notes on the skeletal system. Normally, when we think of the skeletal system, we think of bones, but there are other tissues associated with the skeleton besides bones, and that would be cartilage and ligaments and tendons. Ligaments will attach bone to bones, tendons will attach muscle to bone, and then cartilage is found on the ends of bones to help the articulations or the joints move freer. Cartilage is sometimes laid down in the embryo for bone to form over. So it's important for us to look at some of these other tissues as well as the bones. So we'll start out our lecture with skeletal cartilage. So skeletal cartilage is found on or between bones for flexibility. One type of ossification or bone production actually begins with cartilage. If you look at the end of this long bone, you'll see that there's a light blue shiny substance there. That's cartilage. That's actually hyaline cartilage or articulating cartilage, and you can see that it'll make the ends of the bones nice and smooth, so there'll be almost friction-free movement. Also, you'll see to the left of the screen a picture of cartilage under the microscope. You might remember it from the tissue lab. So let's look at the basic structure of cartilage. There's a picture on your note sheet that looks something like this. Cartilage is a connective tissue, so we know all connective tissues have cells that are spread out, a matrix in between, and in the matrix is our fibers. So this is a connective tissue, so it has cells called chondrocytes that are spread out. The chondrocytes are found in little cavities called lacunae, or a lacuna, and surrounding the lacunae is the matrix that's mostly water and fibers. So it makes it a very almost plastic-like matrix, one that is tough but actually has a little bit of flexibility. So looking at our picture, the chondrocytes are the cells with the dark staining nuclei. They're in a cavity called the lacuna, and in between the lacunae is the matrix, and you can see some very fine fibers in this matrix. Cartilage has no nerves and no blood vessels, so you might be asking yourself, well, how do these cells get their oxygen and nutrients and get rid of waste particles if they have no direct blood vessels or nerve supply? Well, it all has to do with a membrane that surrounds the cartilage called the perichondrium. Think about the prefix peri, like perimeter, it's around. Chondrium is cartilage. This is around the cartilage, and in this thin membrane that not only surrounds and supports, there is a very good blood supply. There are blood vessels there that are actually going to maintain the cartilage cells. So that box that's around the picture of the cartilage on your notes, you can label as perichondrium. Very important part of cartilage. So how does cartilage grow? Well, cartilage is going to grow in width and in length. Anytime you have cartilage and later on bone growing in width, we call that appositional growth. And you can see I have a picture of a bone there that's growing in width, and the same goes for cartilage. Cells are going to be added to the outside, and it's going to get wider and wider and wider. So this is outside or growth that has to do with the width. And I always, when I look at that word appositional, I see all those O's, and I think about the O getting wider and wider and wider. So the growth is coming from the perichondrium. The other kind of growth is called interstitial growth. Oh, I forgot I had this little picture on there. You can see that it's going to grow wider and wider. The other kind of growth is interstitial growth. This is growth that comes from the inside, and it increases cartilage and later bone in length, and this is coming from the chondrocytes themselves. I always like to think of interstitial and seeing the bone as a long eye, and if the bone gets longer, it's interstitial or growth in length. So appositional growth is width. It comes from the outside, adding tissue to the outside. Interstitial comes from the inside, and it's growing in length. There are three types of cartilage that we see associated with the skeletal system. Hyaline cartilage is the one that I pointed out a while ago. It looks like slick frosted glass. It has a light blue color. It's found on the ends of bones. it is the most abundant, and the fibers there are very fine collagen fibers, so you almost can't see it when you look at it under a microscope. Hyaline cartilage includes articulate cartilage found at the ends of long bones, costal or coastal, I've heard sometimes, cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum or the breastbone. Respiratory cartilage, your trachea and bronchi have cartilaginous rings. It's hyaline cartilage, and those rings help to keep the trachea open all the time. And finally, the cartilage associated with the nose, nasal cartilage, is hyaline cartilage. You'd be surprised that most of your nose, the outside structure of your nose, is cartilage. Only right at the tip top between your eyebrows is actually the nasal bone. The rest is cartilage. That is hyaline cartilage. Another type of cartilage associated with the skeletal system is elastic cartilage, and it's more stretchy than hyaline cartilage because it has elastic fibers in the matrix. We find elastic cartilage in the larynx at the tip top. If you see the little green structure sticking out of the top of the larynx, that's called your epiglottis. And what happens is it actually comes down over the opening to the larynx to keep food out of the larynx and trachea during swallowing, and pops back up because of its elasticity when you're breathing. So that's the larynx. The epiglottis of the larynx. We also find elastic cartilage in the external ear. You can pull your pinnae or your ear down forward and let it go, and it always pops right back up because of that elastic cartilage. The last kind of cartilage we see associated with the skeletal system is fibrocartilage, and this has the greatest compressible strength. It has the greatest tensile strength. That means that it can stretch and come back, recoil very easily. In Mississippi, when the wind blows very hard, like during a tornado, pine trees sometimes will just fall over and their roots will be exposed because they don't have good tensile strength. But other trees, like willow trees, they have the ability to stretch when the wind blows and then pop back to their original shape after the wind is gone. And that's what we want to see in this cartilage. You find fibrocartilage in between the knees. It gives you a pad there, so when you're jumping up and down and those two bones come together, you have a very highly compressible pad between the bones. You also see this between the vertebrae. Your vertebral discs are made of this fibrocartilage. Imagine how heavy your skull is and all those backbones stacked on top of each other. You'd need a material that could withstand the pressure but yet give you some flexibility. You also find fibrocartilage between the pubic bones of the hip in the front. Is actually called the pubis symphysis, and especially in women, that's going to give you a little bit of flexibility during childbirth. So enough about cartilage. Let's move on to bones. There are approximately 206 bones in the human body. We divide those bones according to their location. We have one group of bones we say are axial bones. They're part of the central axis. It includes the skull bones, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. Another division of the skeletal system is the appendicular, those bones that are appendages of the axial. And that's going to include your upper and lower girdles. Your upper girdle is your shoulder girdle or your pectoral girdle that includes your shoulder blade and your collarbone. And then the lower girdle are your hip bones or your pelvic girdle. Attached to the girdle are the upper and lower limbs. So that would be the arms, and the hands and the legs and the feet. Another way to classify bones is according to their shape. One of the bones that we study the most, because it's the largest bone, is a long bone. It's longer than it is wide, and all of your arm and leg or your limb bones, except for the kneecap, the wrist, and the ankle, are long bones. So what is the wrist and the ankle bones? Well, they're about as tall as they are wide, so they're not long, but they are short. They're cube-shaped. The patella, which is the kneecap, the carpals, which are the wrists, and the tarsals, which are the ankle bones, are all short bones. So you can see that your appendages are made up of long and short bones. But what about your cranial bones and your sternum or your breastbone, they're very thin and flat, and they kind of have a curve to them, so we call them flat bones. The sternum or the breastbone, the scapula, which is the shoulder blade, the ribs, most of the skull are flat bones. And then if the bones don't fit into the long, short, or flat category, we say that they're irregular bones. They have their own definite little shape. For example, your vertebrae and your os coxa, or which are your hip bones, are examples of irregular bones. So let's practice it. The one in the upper left of your screen is a long bone, short bone, flat bone, irregular bone. So what is the function of the bone? Of course, we know it supports the body. It provides a structure so that we're not a heap of muscle and tissue just in a big blob, but that we actually have a definite structure. So it supports our body. It also offers protection. Think about the heart behind the sternum, the brain in the cranial cavity, the pelvic organs in the pelvis. These all provide protection for the organs underneath. Movement. Muscles are attached to bones, and muscles actually pull on bones to give us our locomotive and our movements that help us to manipulate our environment. So bone functions along with muscle to give us movement. Also, inside of some bones, we have hematopoietic tissue, or tissue that makes blood cells. And so our bones are responsible for making red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Another function of the bone is mineral storage. Our bones are made of calcified salts, particularly calcium phosphate, which makes our bones very hard. So in essence, our bones store the calcium to make the bones hard and supportive, or let go of the calcium if it's needed somewhere else in the body. So mineral storage. Another function of the bone is fat or triglyceride storage. In the shaft of most long bones is a medullary canal, and it's filled with yellow bone marrow, which is mostly fat. And one last function of the bones can be endocrine organs, because they release the hormone osteocalcin, which helps to regulate the bones' remodeling and production. So we have the hormone osteocalcin. As well as osteocalcin helping to regulate the production of bones, it's also been found that it causes the beta cells in the pancreas to release more insulin, and at the same time directing fat cells to release another hormone that increases the sensitivity to insulin. So it does play a role in insulin release as well. Now let's move on to the gross anatomy of bones. When we look at bones, there's actually two types of bone tissue there based on the texture. Most bones have an outer shell of compact bone. This is bone that's very dense and very hard. Whereas compact bone is the outer layer, very hard and dense. Spongy bone is found on the inside of bone, and it is very fragile. It's just branches of very thin pieces of bone with spaces in between. And in those spaces, you will find bone marrow. So let's look at the picture of the long bone that's in your notes, and let's label compact bone tissue versus spongy bone tissue. We know that the shell that surrounds the outside of the bone is compact bone tissue, and the bone that's more on the inside, that is very fragile and branches of bone, is called spongy bone tissue. And it's in this spongy bone tissue that we have one type of bone marrow called red bone marrow, where we make blood cells. So let's zoom in and look at some other structures of a typical long bone. Why do we look at long bones and not short or irregular or flat bones? Because they're bigger, and we can see the definite structures with relative ease. So let's look at this long bone. If you notice, there is a shaft in the middle of two heads. That shaft is called the diaphysis. The diaphysis has an outer compact shell, And then on the inside, it's a hollowed out cavity called the medullary canal or cavity. Now this hollowed out cavity is filled with another type of marrow called yellow bone marrow, which is where the triglycerides or fat are stored. And also blood vessels that enter from the outside can enter through nutrient foramina and come into the medullary canal and travel to both ends of the bone. So let's label. We've already done compact and spongy. Now let's label the shaft or the middle part of the long bone called the diaphysis, and then inside the shaft is the medullary canal where we find yellow marrow, the fat. So we said it's a shaft with two swollen ends. Those swollen ends are called epiphyses or an epiphyse. It's just like with the shaft, we have a compact bone forming a shell around. At the end of the two epiphyses, there is articulate or hyaline cartilage. This is going to help when one bone joins or articulates with another bone to have a smooth surface. Then when we go interior, there's not a cavity like we saw with the shaft, but this is where we find spongy bone. Spongy bone filled with red bone marrow. So at the epiphyseal ends, inside the bone, we have spongy bone tissue filled with red bone marrow. So we've already labeled these structures. Now this is an epiphyse, and actually this is a humerus, and that's the elbow end, so we could say that was the distal epiphyse, whereas this is the proximal epiphyse. And what is that substance that covers the articulate ends? Hyaline or articulate cartilage. So let's look at a feature at the epiphyse. Do you see on this picture that when the bone develops, a long bone develops, that cartilage is replaced by bone? Where the epiphyse joins to the diaphysis, there is a plate that used to be cartilage. In the adult, it's ossified bone, but in a child, that plate is cartilage, and this is where you can increase the length of your bone or have interstitial growth. When you become an adult and you've reached your maximum height, that area of cartilage, which was the epiphyseal plate, turns into the epiphyseal line. So you could actually take an x-ray of a child that's around 12 and see if that epiphyseal, the region where the epiphyse joins the diaphysis, if it's still cartilage or if it's bone. If it's still cartilage, then there's potential for more growth and height, but if it's ossified into bones, that's as tall as the child will be. If the cartilage is still there and the child hasn't reached a potential height, the doctor could give the child growth hormone to increase the growth and height. Of course, it is linked to DNA as well as it is to that growth hormone. So let's label what we've already labeled. And now we're going to label the epiphyseal line. Why did I call this an epiphyseal line and not an epiphyseal plate? Because it's bone, so this bone is as long as it will be. So let's talk about the membranes associated with the bones. Just like we had the perichondrium on the outside of cartilage, we have the periosteum on the outside of bones. This covers the entire long bones except at those articulate ends where we have articulate cartilage. Even though this is a membrane, it is a very tough membrane. It has two layers. The superficial layer is the fibrous layer, and the inner layer is osteogenic. And you might say, well, what is osteogenic? That means to produce bone. So from that inner osteogenic layer, we can produce bone from the outside, making the bone wider. What kind of growth did we call that, where we made a bone wider? Appositional growth. So it's going to come from that layer of the periosteum. This periosteum is rich in lymph vessels, nerves, blood vessels, and it's actually the place where nutrient arteries will enter and go into the bone and run at right angles up and down the bone. So it is the place for blood vessels to enter through. Also attached to the periosteum are ligaments and tendons. So you know it has to be tough if the muscle is pulling on this tissue layer when we flex or extend or move our bones. So let's go back to our picture. Let's label what we've already labeled. And now let's add that outside membrane called the periosteum. What does the periosteum do? Not only does it protect and provide appositional growth, it anchors tendons. Tendons join what to what? Bones to muscles. And ligaments, since there's a L there that tells you ligaments attach like things, bones to bones. So that's the periosteum. Now, if we go inside the medullary canal and up into the spaces of the spongy bone, we see another kind of membrane. It's not on the perimeter, but it's inside, so it's called the endosteum. And it is also osteogenic. So that means that we can, it plays a role in bone growth as well. So let's label all the structures we've already labeled. There's the periosteum, and now we've added the endosteum. So now you should be able to label this long bone. Since we've taken quite a while to go over this long bone, you can anticipate that we will have this on the test, that you will have to label these structures of the long bone. So now let's look at the macroscopic structure of short, irregular, and flat bones. Just like with long bones, we're going to have a thin layer of compact bone making the shell, and then on the inside we're going to have spongy bone. The endosteum and the periosteum cover all of the spongy tissues, so that means that the periosteum's on the outside and the endosteum wraps all on the inside. In flat bones, since there is this thin branching, it kind of looks like spongy bone is sandwiched between compact bone. We call that arrangement diploe. So when you hear the word diploe, with flat bones especially, it means we have compact, spongy, compact. The spongy is sandwiched between the compact bone. Now, let's talk about another kind of tissue associated with bones, and that is hemopoietic tissue. Hemopoietic means to produce blood. We know that in the red bone marrow that's found in spongy bone tissue at the epiphyseal ends of long bones, in the diploe of flat bones, and inside of irregular bones, this is where we make blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So it's the epiphyseal ends in diploe, in flat and irregular bones. Now, in a newborn who's trying to produce all those millions and billions of blood cells, we have a little extra help. Actually, the yellow marrow is absent. Red marrow goes down into the medullary canal. It's found in all spongy bone, and also the spleen is a little hemopoietic as well. But in the adult, the most active hemopoietic sites are in flat bones like the sternum and irregular bones like the pelvis. You can see on this picture all those dark spots. That's where there's hemopoietic tissue. Now, in cases of anemia, and you might say, well, what's anemia? It's the decreased ability to carry oxygen because either your red blood cells are in low supply or they're defective and they're not carrying oxygen well. In times of anemia, because your body really needs the oxygen, your yellow marrow will convert into red marrow and start producing blood cells as well. But this is only in times of severe anemia. So let's move on to another macroscopic feature, and it's called bone markings. In lab, you should be going over all the processes, bulges, depressions, holes that are found on bones. These are sites for ligaments and tendons to attach. This is places for blood vessels to enter and move through the body, or nerves. And you'll learn in quite a bit of detail what each one of these processes is and the name of these processes on the bones. But very quickly, Table 6.1 in your textbook lists some of these markings. For example, a tuberosity is a large rounded projection that might be roughened, and you can see the ischial tuberosity on this hip bone, and so you can imagine that the ischial tuberosity is a rough place so that it can join another structure. At the top of that hip bone, when you place your hands on top of your hips, you're placing it on a crest, which is a narrow ridge, so that is the iliac crest. A trochanter is only found on the femur, and this is a large hook-like projection that attaches to some of those big muscles of the thigh, trochanter. If you run your finger down the back of the femur, you'll feel like a little line. So it's a narrow ridge, less prominent than a crest. It's called a line or a linea. The one that's on the back of the femur is the linea aspera. A tubercle is a small rounded process. On your humerus, instead of having trochanters, you have tubercles, and you can see a tubercle on the bottom of this femur. It's just a small rounded projection. Epicondyle, you really have to know what a condyle is first. A condyle is a knuckle-like projection on this femur. If you can imagine that somebody's wrapped their fingers around the end of the bones and you're seeing the knuckles, those are the condyles. And then structures found above the condyles are epicondyles. A spine is a sharp, slender projection. You see the spinous process of the vertebrae. You see the ischial spine on the humerus. Process is just a general name given to any of these projections or bony prominences that we see in the skeletal system. A head, when we talked about the long bone, we said it was a shaft with two swollen ends. Well, a lot of times one of those swollen ends will be called a head, and it'll be on a narrow neck. A facet is a smooth surface, especially like where the ribs will attach to the vertebrae or the sternum. A condyle, we talked about a condyle with the femur. It's a knuckle-like extension. A ramus is an arm-like bar, and you see the rami of the mandible. A groove is a furrow, just like a deep line going down the bone. A fissure is a narrow slit-like opening. You can especially see them in the back of the orbitals or the eye sockets. I always think about when I go fishing, I want to put my line right into the perfect spot, a little slit area. So slit-like opening is a fissure. The word foramen means a hole, a round or oval opening. The plural for that is foramina, but foramen, the hole in the bottom of the skull where the spinal cord comes up and meets the brain, is called the foramen magnum because it is the biggest hole. A notch would just be an indention, a little indention at the edge of a structure. A meatus is a canal-like passageway. Your ear canal, your auditory meatus, is a good example, external auditory or acoustic meatus. A sinus is an air-filled cavity, usually lined with mucous membranes. A fossa is a basin-like depression. You can run your finger up and through it, so it's deeper than a groove. It's a basin-like area, a fossa. So you will go over these in more detail in lab, but you have to know what a meatus is if you're trying to find the external auditory meatus. You might think auditory has something to do with hearing, but if you didn't know a meatus was a canal, you'd probably never find the ear canal. So let's practice with this. What is a condyle? Rounded articulate projection, knuckle-like. A facet, flat. A fissure, slit-like opening. A foramen is a round or oval hole. A fossa is a shallow basin-like depression. A groove is a furrow. A head, a bony expansion carried on a narrow neck. A meatus is a canal. A notch is an indentation at the edge of a structure. Ramus is an arm-like bar, and a sinus is an air-filled cavity. So now they're in order of their definitions. So let's move on from macroscopic anatomy to microscopic. If you remember looking at bone in the lab, it looked like tree trunks. Because tree trunks, the tissue is arranged in concentric circle, and so in compact bone, that's exactly how the bone tissue is arranged, concentric circles. What I mean by concentric circles is one circle inside of another circle. So let's look at the microscopic structure of compact bone. We call the arrangement of concentric circles the Harvasian system, or an osteon unit. So an osteon is an elongated cylinder that runs parallel to the bone and is one circle inside of another circle. The matrix is arranged in concentric layers called lamella. So each circle inside of another circle, that bone tissue is called lamellae, plural, lamella, singular. The matrix, just like all connective tissue matrix, has fibers in it, and we have collagen fibers in the matrix to reinforce it. And notice that each concentric circle, as we go from superficial to deep, that the collagen fibers are running in an alternating pattern, and that gives us more strength and flexibility. Now, inside of the matrix, we also have salt crystals, and their arrangement is alternating too, so that you build up on the strength. So the collagen fibers give the bone flexibility or tensile strength, while the salt crystals in their arrangement give the bones hardness. So let's look at one of these osteon units. Let's pull one of those cylinders out. We know that each concentric circle is a lamella. The lamella circle around a central or Harvasian canal with right-angled perforating canals filled with blood vessels and nerves. So you have your central canal running parallel with the bone itself, and then running in perpendicular are those nutrient foramina, that perforating canals where the blood vessels and nerves enter. You can see in the picture of the bone tissue itself that you saw in the tissue lab, that center dark part, that's where the blood vessels and the nerves are, is very dark, and it's in the center. And then the concentric circles of lamella around it. So we have the lamella labeled, and now we have the Harvasian or the central canal. At the junctions of the lamella, there are spaces that have osteocytes in them. The spaces are called lacunae, and the bone cells are called osteocytes. We saw lacunae in the chondrocyte. That's what chondrocytes and cartilage were located in as well. So a lacuna is a space where we find an osteocyte in bone tissue, or we find a chondrocyte in cartilage. It's a little cavity or space. You might be saying to yourself, if these osteocytes are in these little spaces called lacuna out in the junction of the lamella, how in the world do they get their nutrients and oxygen and get rid of their waste particles? Because they're a long way away from that vein and that artery. Well, do you see the little radiating canals going from the central canal out to each one of the lacunae? Those are called canaliculi, and so the products are carried from that central location out to the individual bone cells. So we know this is lamella. We know this is the central canal. So now we know the space is called a lacuna, and inside the lacuna is an osteocyte, and the little canals that connect the osteocytes to their blood supply are called canaliculi. Now notice on this picture that the osteon units are cylinders running the same direction parallel with the bone itself, but then in between the little columns there's bone tissue as well. That is called interstitial lamella. It's not concentric circles, but it's there to support and add strength. And then notice that you have this outer circumferential lamella too that wraps around the outside of the compact bone, that also gives us extra strength. So you have your little osteon units, but filled in between them is interstitial lamella, and wrapping around them is circumferential lamella. So you should be able to label this microscopic osteon unit that's found in compact bone. What is number 1? An osteocyte. What is number 2? Lamella. What is number 3? It says it's not the cell, so it must be the space, the lacuna. What is number 4? Canaliculi. Number 5, the central canal. And 6 says that this is an osteon unit found in compact bone tissue. So what about spongy bone tissue? Well, there are no osteon units in spongy bone. It's very fragile, and it has branches of bone called trabeculae. Now let me just tell you something about this word trabeculae. You will actually see this word a lot in later chapters because anytime we have a tissue that branches, we sometimes call it trabeculae. So these are branches of bone. Some of them have irregular looking lamella housing osteocytes and lacunae connected by canaliculi. So when you look in the structure, it kind of reminds you of an osteon unit, but it doesn't have um, the structure or it's not as regular in its pattern because it's so thin. And also notice what's missing is the central canal. Since these trabeculae are so small, the blood can actually diffuse from the spaces into the trabeculae through the canaliculi and not have to have that central Harvasian canal that houses the blood vessels. Simply by diffusion, we're going to diffuse from outside to the inside. And so you see an irregular lamella with the osteocytes still in lacunae, still have the canaliculi, but this time we're going to diffuse the blood in. There is no central canal. So that was a microscopic overview of compact and spongy bone. Now let's look at the chemical composition of bone. The bone is going to be made of organic compounds and inorganic compounds. Remember, organic compounds have more to do with the living. They always have carbon in them. Well, organic compounds include the cells. We have three kinds of cells basically in bone tissue. That would be the osteocyte, which is the bone cell, the osteoblast, blast means maker, so this is going to make the bone matrix, and osteoclast, which are going to break down the bone matrix. An osteoid is actually the fibers and the ground substance inside the matrix that are secreted by the osteoblast, and this is going to give the bone not only flexibility but tensile strength. Remember that the fibers give us the ability to bend and recoil, where it's the calcified salts that give us hardness. So that would be the inorganic compounds. Hydroxyapatite is the fancy chemical word we call calcium phosphate crystals. Those crystals, remember, form around the fibers in alternating patterns to give the bone hardness. So we want our bones not only to be hard to provide that structure and support, but we want them to have a little flexibility so when we jump up and down, our bones don't break because they're hard and brittle, but we want them hard and flexible. And that would be the collagen fibers or the organic part that gives us that flexibility and tensile strength. So how do bones develop? The process of bone development is called osteogenesis, genesis in the beginning, osteobone, or sometimes we just say ossification. So the definition of ossification is the process of bone tissue formation. Your bone starts developing when you're an embryo in your mother's womb. It continues to grow and change through childhood and adolescence, both in appositional and interstitial growth. And then as an adult, it constantly remodels. Some people are erroneous in thinking that bones are stagnant, that they never change, but they're constantly remodeling. If you gain weight, your bones have to get thicker to support your bigger structure. And if you start running a marathon, then the muscles are going to be pulling on your bones differently, so they have to change their shape to withstand that extra pressure. Formation of the bony skeleton. Before an embryo is 8 weeks, there is going to be a pattern laid down for your bones. It's either going to be a cartilage pattern or a fibrous membrane pattern. And then after 8 weeks, the bone starts replacing the membrane or the cartilage pattern. And you can see from this picture of a child where there's some spaces between the bones, that there's cartilage present, whereas the picture on the other side shows that ossification is almost complete. So there are two types of ossification, one that forms over a membrane and one that forms over cartilage. The one that forms over a membrane is called intramembraneous ossification. There is one center of ossification. Some of the flat bones are formed this way. I'm not sure about that page number, but figure 6.9 shows intramembranous ossification. What I want you to know is that intramembranous ossification has one center of ossification and it forms over a fibrous membrane pattern. If you think about skull bones that when a baby's first born, we're so careful of their head because of the soft spots, and that's because this fibrous membrane is there and the bones haven't completely ossified over it. So we're very protective until that bone completely fills in. It also allows the cranial cavity the ability to grow larger. So what are the steps in intramembranous? Ossification center appears in the fibrous connective tissue. Then osteoid is secreted within the fibrous membrane and calcifies. Then woven bone and periosteum form. Then lamellar bone replaces the woven bone just deep to the periosteum, and red marrow appears. Remember, this is how some flat bones form, and that would be diploe. The other way we make bone is called endochondral ossification. That root word chondra means cartilage, so this is going to happen in the cartilage pattern. All the bones, except for some skull bones in the clavicle, form this way. There are two centers of ossification, and what we have is a cartilage pattern. In your book, figure 6.8 shows that about the 9th week, the cartilage that was there on the pattern, in the original pattern, starts one primary ossification center right in the center of the shaft, and it starts to form from the inside out, and that's going to form the diaphysis of long bones. And then at birth, a second ossification center begins at the epiphyseal ends, and this enables the bone to continue to grow in length as well as width. And so during childhood and adolescence, the epiphyses ossify completely, and you change from having an epiphyseal plate to an epiphyseal line. After the postnatal bone growth in infancy and youth, bones lengthen at that epiphyseal plate by giving us interstitial growth. Remember, interstitial growth is in length, appositional growth is in width. So looking at this picture, if you notice the end that's closest to the shaft of the bone, that's where the new bone is being produced. The epiphyseal plate is closer to the end, or the epiphyseal end. So closer to the shaft, that cartilage, those cartilage cells are replaced by bone, and what it does, it kind of pushes the head away from the shaft. So when we look at that epiphyseal plate, we see some definite areas of change. Starting at the end closest to the epiphyseal end, or the head of the bone, we see an area of growth or proliferation. This is where the cartilage cells increase, and as they multiply, they increase the length or the depth of that area. The epiphysis is pushed away from the diaphysis. In this new area, as we get closer to the shaft, those new cartilage cells start to get very big, and then they start to calcify. They change from being cartilage into being bone. And so you have the osteogenic zone that's nearest the diaphysis, and this is where we complete our bone growth. So let's look at this website to understand about bone growth in a little more detail. This says, ever notice how a baby's bones are very small and fragile compared to adult bones? The finger and the toes on a baby are so very much smaller than ours, yet they become quite huge over time. How do bones get so much bigger over time? Bones grow over time, but they also get thicker. There is a mechanism that allows all bones to grow in both length and width. Growth and length. To make a bone longer, just add bone tissue to the ends. But the problem is we can't add directly to the end of the bone. It has to to move at the joints. If tissue is added at the end of the bone, the skeleton would not move properly. It's like closing both lanes on an interstate until a bridge is repaired. For this to work, bone tissue must be added below the joint somewhere along the length of the bone. It occurs at the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate. Here, chondrocytes first produce hyaline cartilage. The cartilage then becomes calcified or ossified to form hard bone tissue, involving the addition of calcium and phosphorus ions. The chondrocytes produce cartilage on one side of the plate and push the end of the bone up. The other side of the epiphyseal plate gradually becomes calcified. Once a person reaches adulthood and the bones have reached their maximum length, the whole plate gets calcified. It forms an invisible line called the epiphyseal line. Common sense would tell us to make a bone longer, you just add bone tissue to the ends. The problem is we can't because of the joints. Let's look at it again. So now we know how bones grow in length. Let's look at how bones grow in width, or appositional growth. Making a bone grow in diameter is a more straightforward process. To make a bone thicker, just add new bone tissue to the outside. It's like taking a pipe and adding layer and layer of duct tape to it. The pipe would get thicker and heavier as you go. The problem is the bone gets thicker and heavier as you go. In fact, you started with a bone the size of a baby's and make it into as large as an adult, you would have a bone that's essentially solid. Baby bone would have a very small marrow cavity. Since we don't want to weigh an extra couple of hundred of pounds more than we do, it's important to take away excess bone tissue from the inside. That way, the bone can grow in diameter, get thicker, but not completely fill up the bone tissue. Using proper terms, we add tissue to the periosteal side of the bone and remove it from the endosteal side. In growing bone, we find osteoblast on the periosteal side of bone and osteoclast on the endosteal side, removing some bone tissue. Let's look at this little video to watch how it's done. So each time we make the bone thicker, we have to make the medullary canal bigger as well. So osteoblast, make it thicker. Osteoclast, increase the size of the medullary canal so we don't have these huge bones that our muscles have to try to move around. So all bones grow in thickness by appositional growth. We have osteoblast of the periosteum, increase bone on the outside, while osteoclast increase the size of the medullary canal. Most bones stop growing in adolescence or early adulthood. There are two bones, though, your nasal bone and your jaw bone, that continue throughout your life. As we get older, our face becomes more angular. So how do we control bone growth? We do it with hormones. Growth hormone is a hormone that causes the epiphyseal plate to increase, while T3 and T4 thyroid hormones make sure that our bones are in the right proportions. Sex hormones at puberty also increase the growth of our bones and then stop the growth at the epiphyseal place when our maximum height is reached. So how do we remodel bone as an adult? Bone is deposited by osteoblast and bone is resorbed by osteoclast. Remember, clasp, break, and blast, make. So we put down bone tissue with osteoblast and take away bone tissue with osteoclast. This remodeling is controlled by two hormones as well. Parathyroid hormone stimulates the osteoclast to break down bone material when we need the calcium in the bone and other areas of the body. Calcitrol helps us to absorb calcium in our intestines. So it along with parathyroid hormone help to regulate and keep our calcium levels correct in our blood. But what if our calcium levels are high in our blood? Well, then we're going to store it into our bones, and that's going to be with the hormone calcitonin. I always think calcitonin into the bone. So that means parathyroid must take it out of the bone. So our bones are constantly remodeling according to changes in our body size and the mechanical stresses we put on our body. Notice in this picture that the tennis player's serving arm is thicker in the cross-sectional area than the non-serving arm because she's putting more stress with her muscles, and so we would apply more bone tissue to that particular humerus. So what about if we break a bone? Because bones are very vascular, they're going to repair and remodel quite efficiently, a lot quicker than a ligament or a tendon would in a sprain. In your book, they give you the different types of fractures. You can read that for your own knowledge, but I'm not going to test you on it. Really, all I want to know is that when you do fracture a bone, what are the 4 steps in repair? The first step is that you make a hematoma. You clot off the blood supply because it's very vascular. It will be bleeding. So first you make a hematoma or a clot. Then you're going to lay down the cartilage pattern. So you're going to form a fibrocartilaginous callus. And then just like when you made bone originally, the cartilage is going to be replaced by a bony callus. So you're going to have bone tissue laid down. And then finally the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts will do some fine-tuning or remodeling so that the bone is almost back to its original state. And that leads us into Chapter 7. Chapter 7 actually goes over the 206 bones that make up the skeletal system. You're really going to do this more in detail in the lab setting, but what I've done is I've picked out a few of the bones and looked at some of the important prominences or processes on them, or some of the features that we see, so that you'll be familiar not only with the pictures of the bone, but a description of the bone as well. So let's look at the axial bones too. There's about 80 axial bones. Remember, the axial system includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. So let's start with the skull that's made up of about 22 bones. We normally divide the skull into cranial bones and facial bones. So looking at the pictures, just let me point out the cranial bones first. The nice golden one in the front, of course, the frontal bone. The top and the sides is kind of a fuchsia pink. Those are the parietal bones. The base of the skull is brown. It's the occipital bones. The lateral sides of the skull are the temporal bones, and you can see the ear canal there. Then that little kind of purpley pink wing that you see in front of the temporal bone, that's part of the sphenoid bone, and on the far right you can see how that sphenoid bone travels all the way through the skull. Some people describe it as a bat, a mammal that flies around, if you took it out just by itself. And then the last cranial bone is the ethmoid bone. It's kind of a brownish colored bone. You can see a hint of it in the eye socket, and then you can see it as it emerges in the cranial cavity as a sharp little point. Now, when we look at the skull bones, they're all fused by sutures, which are immovable joints, except for the mandible. It's the only joint, the mandible joint is the only joint that is movable. It's freely movable. If you look inside of the skull or the cranium, you can see 3 distinct layers. If you start in the front layer, it's the most superior and the most anterior, and then it drops down a little bit in the middle part to a little more inferior, and then at the back part of it, the posterior part of the cranium, that's the lowest part, and that supports the cerebrum and the cerebellum very nicely. So the interior cranium has 3 distinct layers or fossae. There are several cavities associated with the skull. We have our middle and inner ear cavities. We have our orbital cavity that houses the eye, the nasal cavity that house the nasal structures, and then we have sinuses that are just air-filled cavities. All of these cavities help to lighten the skull so that our neck muscles don't have to be tremendous to support our skull on our vertebral column. They also house organs like the eyes and ear structures, nasal structures, and then they act as resonance chambers, especially our sinuses. What I mean by resonance is vibrating of sound. Our voice box produces sound, but it's actually that sound bouncing around in our nose and our mouth and our sinuses that give our voice quality or voice. You know, if you have a sinus infection or a stuffed up nose or sore throat, your voice changes because the sound doesn't bounce around the same. So resonance chambers. Now, we said that that orange bone that's on the side is the temporal bone. If you notice, it has like a bridge that connects it to the blue zygomatic bone, which is your cheekbone. That is called the zygomatic arch. Also notice there's a hole there. It's really a canal. It's the external auditory or acoustic meatus. Notice that there's a bump behind the ear canal. I say it's like having a mass behind your ear. It's called the mastoid process, and it's for muscles to attach. And then you see underneath the auditory meatus a little stick-like structure. That's a styloid process, and again, it's an attachment place for nerves and muscle. So all of those are features of the temporal bone. So on the test, I might say, what bone has the mastoid processes, the styloid processes, the external auditory meatus, and the zygomatic arch? And you would tell me the temporal bone. I've already showed you the sphenoid bone, which looks like a bat. If you look in the middle of the body of the bat, you can see an indentation. If we could see a side view, they say it looks like a Turkish saddle or skeletal6. And there is a rider in that saddle, and it is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland used to be called the master endocrine gland because it controls some of the other endocrine organs, but it sits in that saddle, and so it's one of the most protected endocrine glands in the body. So in the sphenoid bone, which is the bat bone, you have the skeletal6, the Turkish saddle for the pituitary gland. That ethmoid bone, you can see just a hint of it in the cranial cavity. It comes up at a little point called the crista galli. That's Latin for rooster's comb. So it sticks up like the comb of a rooster. And what it does, it gives us a place for the meninges or the membranes of the brain to attach. Also on either side of the crista galli, you see the cribriform plates that have little holes in them, olfactory foramina, that the olfactory nerves can pass from the olfactory mucosa of the nose up through those little holes and innervate with the olfactory bulbs of the brain. Also, what we can't see on this picture, but we will be able to see on the next picture, is inside your nose there are these little scroll-like bones called concha bones. And what they do is they create turbulence inside the nose so that the air that you breathe in touches the mucous membrane and is warmed and cleaned. And so it's those concha bones that give us the turbulent. The upper one and the middle one are actually part of the ethmoid bone. Now, we said that people have 206 bones, but actually people have maybe sometimes more bones. When those bones of the skull are forming and going together as sutures, sometimes little bones form in those spaces, and those are called wormian or sutural bones. So you might actually have 207, 208 bones. Now let's move from the cranial bones to the facial bones. There are 14 facial bones. Facial bones on a female are more rounded and less angular. So you know when you watch a show like Bones on TV where you have forensic anthropologists, they really can look at the bones and say whether it's male or female. All of the facial bones articulate with the maxilla, which is the upper jawbone, except for the mandible. The mandible is going to articulate with the cranial bones. The palatine process, which is the top of your mouth, palate of your mouth, the palatine process forms the upper two-thirds or the anterior two-thirds of your palate, so it would be that deep purple bone. But then that gray bone is actually the palatine bone that forms the back one-third of that roof of your mouth. So the palatine process is actually part of the maxilla bone. Now the eye socket is very intricate. It's made up of several small pieces of lots of bones. If you notice at the top of the eye socket you have the frontal bone. In the back you can see the little purple sphenoid bat bone. You can see the light blue zygomatic or cheekbone. You can see the maxilla, which is the purple bone. You can see the palatine bone, which is that little piece of khaki colored at the back. You can see the lacrimal bone that's medial, close to the nose. It's got a hole going through it. It's called the lacrimal duct. It's where your tears come out. And then the ethmoid bone, that bone that makes that crista galli and makes the superior and middle concha, also is found a little bit in the eye socket. So very intricate our eye socket is. Inside the nose, you have three shelves called concha or concha bones, and I described them a while ago when I mentioned the superior and middle concha. They are scroll-like. It's like if I took a piece of paper and I rolled it up in a circle. It makes a scroll so that air is going to flow through that scroll and be turbulent, so it's more likely to touch the mucosa. So the nasal cavity has three shelves. The top one and the middle one are actually part of the ethmoid bone, but the lowest one is a bone by itself called the inferior nasal concha. And if you notice, under each one of those three shelves there's a tube, and remember, tubes through bone are called meatises. So you would have the superior nasal concha and the superior meatus, the middle nasal concha and the middle meatus, the inferior nasal concha and the inferior meatus. Also associated with the skull are your paranasal sinuses. There are four pair of these paranasal sinuses. There's one pair found in the frontal bone, another pair in the ethmoid bone, another pair in the sphenoid bone, and the last pair in the maxilla or maxillary bones. If you've ever gone to the doctor and they thought you had a sinus infection, the doctor may have thumped you under your eyes or above your eyes because the frontal and the maxillary are the bigger of the sinuses. If you have a sinus infection, they're going to watch your reaction. Of course, you're going to jump because it hurts. But they're also doing a tympanic sound test because there's supposed to be air-filled cavities, not mucus-filled cavities, and so that's going to change the sound produced when they thump it. There is one more bone associated with the skull, and it is called the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is unique in that it does not join or articulate with any other bone in the body. It instead attaches to the tongue and to the voice box. So it's a pretty good test question. What bone does not articulate with any other bone? It is the hyoid bone. Three more bones dealing with the skull, and they are the ossicles or the ear bones. You may know them as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, but technically they are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And what happens is the eardrum is vibrated by sound waves, which causes these three bones to vibrate. The vibration is transferred to the stapes, and it's sitting on an oval window that causes the oval window to vibrate. The oval window is part of a structure that's filled with fluid and has little sensory hairs inside it. So when the oval window vibrates, the fluid vibrates, which causes the hairs to vibrate, and there we turn the mechanical signal into an electrochemical signal that's sent to the brain and interpreted as sound. This gives you an idea of how big the ossicles or the ear bones are. The malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Before we go to the vertebral column, I want to go back just to make sure that you recognize the facial bones. Let me get to a picture that has them. That bright royal blue, that's your two nasal bones. The dark purple, the upper jaw is the maxilla. The mandible is the kind of coral jawbone. The light blue is the zygomatic bone. The little green one is the lacrimal bone. The little gray khaki colored one is the palatine bone. And I'm looking for the vomer, which is found right inside the nose, right above the maxilla bone would be the vomer. And I didn't see a picture of it right off, but that is another facial bone. So let's move out of the skull and into the vertebral column. You have 5 different kinds of vertebrae. The first 7 are called cervical vertebrae. They're found in the neck. The next 12 are thoracic vertebrae. They're found in the chest cavity. Then the small of the back, 5 lumbar. Then you have 1 sacral bone. It was 5, but it fused together. And then you have 3 to 5 fused or 1 coccygeal or coccyx vertebrae. They say you can remember about the number of vertebrae by remembering that you eat breakfast at 7, lunch at noon or 12, and dinner at 5. And then there's one of the last 2. Now, the vertebrae are stacked one on top of each other, but we don't stack them so that they run parallel to the axis or perpendicular to the floor. Instead, we have curvatures. The cervical and lumbar curvatures are concave, while the thoracic and sacral curvatures are convex. And what that does, it lowers your skull, it lowers your center of gravity so that you can balance standing erect. If it were not for that lower center of gravity, your skull would be so heavy and you'd be so straight you'd just topple over. Another part of the axial system is the bony thorax. So let's look at the ribs. There are 3 kinds of ribs. One type of rib actually attaches to the vertebrae and the sternum directly by small pieces of cartilage. These are called vertebrosternal ribs. They are the 7 first pair. They are true ribs. The next 3 pair are called false ribs. They're vertebrochondral because they attach to the vertebrae and then cartilage that attaches to the sternum. The last 2 don't attach to the sternum at all, and so they are called floating ribs. So we have 12 pair of ribs. In the front, the ribs are attached, some of the ribs are attached to the sternum. The sternum has 3 basic parts. The most anterior part, you can almost, it looks like an M, is called the manubrium. Then the main part of the sternum is the body, and the inferior little part is the xiphoid process. I always think of X marks the spot because they find that spot, they palpate that spot and go like 2 or 3 fingers above it to do CPR so that when they're doing the compressions, they're doing it on the body of the sternum and not on that little fragile xiphoid process which could pierce the heart. Let's move to the appendicular bones. There are 126 appendicular bones. We have the bones that are associated with the pectoral girdle or your shoulder girdle. Your shoulder girdle is made of the shoulder blade, which is the scapula, the clavicle, which is the collarbone. And notice that the collarbone goes and sits on top of the manubrium of the sternum. Attached to the pectoral girdle is the humerus, the upper arm bone, the radius and the ulna, the 2 lower arm bones, the carpals, which are wrists, the metacarpals, which are your palms, and the phalanges, which are your fingers. Notice that the radius attaches to the thumb and the ulna is going to make up the elbow. So when you pronate or supinate your hand, you're moving that radius from lateral to medial. It radiates around, but it's always following the thumb. Now, how many phalanges do you have associated with your upper appendage? Well, if we count the phalanges, we have 1, 2, 3 on the little finger, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then the thumb only has 2 phalanges, so we have a total of 14 phalanges. Is that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 phalanges on each hand. So that gives us 28 phalanges on our upper appendage. Now let's move to the lower appendages, the legs, hooked to the pelvic girdle, or the os coxa bone, the hip bones. Your hip bones are fused together too. The 3 parts of the fused hip bone are the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. The ilium is the big fanned area. The ischium is the part that you would sit on in the back, and the most anterior part is the pubis. The ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. The big thigh bone is the femur. The kneecaps are the patella, and even though they sit on top of the femur, they're actually attached to the lower bone, the tibia. The tibia is the big lower bone, and the fibula one is the smaller bone. Then you have the ankles, which are tarsals, the sole of the foot, which are metatarsals, and the toes, which are phalanges. Let me go back up to the tibia and fibula. Students get these two mixed up. Tibia is the big bone. Fibula, is on the lateral surface. If you tell a little lie, you're telling a fib. So the fibula is the small one on the lateral surface. Fibula, tibia is the big one. Now let's go back to those phalanges. And by the way, one phalange is called a phalanx. So phalanges is plural, phalanx is single. So how many phalanges does a foot have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and the big toe only has 2, so 14. So we have 14 and 14, 28. So how many phalanges do we have in our entire body? 28 plus 28 is 56. And here, I said this a while ago, even though the patella lays on top of the femur, it's actually attached by a ligament to the tibia. These last slides show us the difference between a male and female pelvis. You can read these charts for yourself, but notice that the male is more angular, the female's is more rounded. The bone is less thick for a female. The pubic arch is greater than 90 for a female, usually less than 90, like 50 to 60 on a male. Notice that the sacrum is wider and shorter, and the sacral groove is more accentuated in a female. In a male, the greater sciatic notch is narrow and deep, whereas with a female it's wide and shallow. And that's the part that grooves in under the crest. If you look down into the pelvic outlet, you can see that a female is more oval from side to side, where a male is basically more heart-shaped. And that has to do with childbirth. And here's just some more pictures showing the wider U-shaped pubic arch of the female, the more V-shaped of the male. And that leads us into Chapter 8, Joints and Articulations. Now, we're not going to cover this entire chapter. We're just going to look at the different types of joints based functionally and structurally, and then we're going to talk about the movements produced at joints. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on Chapter 8. There are two ways to classify joints, either by their function or by their structure. Let's look at the functional names first. We have immovable notes that are called synarthrosis joints. I always think it would be a sin if they moved, so that's how I remember. Synarthrosis is immovable. Amphithrosis are those that are slightly movable, and diarthrosis are those that are freely movable. We also name joints according to the structure or the material they're made out of. Some joints are fibrous tissue that bind the bones together, so we call those fibrous joints. Let me give you 3 types of fibrous joints. Between the skull bones, remember we have sutures. That is fibrous connective tissue found between the skull bones, and as the skull bones grow and ossify, it just becomes a wavy interlocking line. Another fibrous joint that's slightly movable or sometimes immovable depending on the ligament length is a syndesmosis, and you find one of those where the fibula and the tibia attach. It's sometimes as we get older that tendon loses some of its elasticity, and it will stretch and be more movable than it once was. And finally, the last fibrous joint is not really between bone and bone, but bone and your teeth. It's your periodontal ligament that's found down in your tooth socket to help secure the tooth to the bone. Gomphosis. So those are 3 examples of fibrous joints. Another way to classify according to the structure is cartilaginous. It's cartilage that binds the 2 bones together. Synchondrosis. Let's break that word down. Syn would be a synarthrosis or an immovable joint made of cartilage. So a synchondrosis is a plate or a bar of cartilage. Remember that epiphyseal plate where we increased our interstitial growth from? That is a good example of a synchondrosis joint. Another example of a cartilaginous joint is a symphysis. This is a plate or a pad of fibrocartilage that's slightly movable. Our vertebral disc, our symphysis, where our two pubic bones come together. That would be a symphysis. There's slight movement there. Where our ribs attach to our sternum, symphysis, it's slightly movable. Cartilaginous joint. And then the last category based on structure is a synovial joint. The bones are separated by a synovial cavity filled with synovial fluid lined with synovial membranes. It's like somebody takes a sleeve and puts it around both bones, and inside that sleeve where the bones aren't is a space, and that space is filled with fluid. So the bones are held together by an outer sleeve or a fibrous capsule and reinforced with ligaments superficial to that. The articulating ends of the bones are also covered with hyaline cartilage that reduces friction. Also inside of synovial joints you might find fatty pads or articulating disc or menisci or bursae or even tendon sheaths that surround the tendon so it has something to slide through. All of those structures are found in different locations but help to lubricate and pad and make the joint work almost friction free. It separates the structures, reduces frictions, and helps cushion the joints. You may have heard of somebody that gets older that says, oh, my bursitis is acting up. So that means that the little pillow inside of their joint is inflamed and it's hurting to move that particular part. This is a picture that shows a synovial cavity. You can see that it has like a sleeve around the outside, and outside of the sleeve are ligaments. Inside is the synovial membrane, and it's filled with synovial fluid. And you can see the two articulating ends have hyaline cartilage on them to help with that reduced friction. So now let's move to the types of movements we see at freely movable and slightly movable joints. This is going to be important to you not only in this chapter but in the next chapter when we talk about the muscles, because we'll say this muscle is responsible for flexing or extending these bones, and you have to know what that word means in order to see how the muscle functions. So it's important for us to learn the types of freely movable joints and the types of movements produced there. So let's look at the types of joints first. We have plane joints that provide a gliding movement. That would be like in your wrist muscles, wrist bones. For example, you've seen queens that just wave from side to side. That would be a plane joint giving you a gliding movement. Another type of joint is a hinge joint. That's going to be movement on one plane. Think about a hinge on a cabinet. It allows the cabinet to open on one plane and then go back. That would be like your elbow or your knee. Another joint is a pivot joint, and this is where you have a sleeve or a rung that fits inside, a bone fits inside the sleeve or rung. That would be a good example of the radius. When that radius bone radiates from lateral to medial, it can do that because of that pivot joint or that sleeve that surrounds the head of the radius. A condyloid joint is where you have an oval surface fitting into a depression, and that gives you movement on two planes, and that would be like where your metacarpals join your phalanges. Not only can you do your fingers up and down, you can move them side to side. A saddle joint is unique to humans because it gives you an opposable thumb. It's like a rider in a saddle, and it is the joint of your thumb, concave into convex. And then probably the movable joint you're most familiar with is the ball and socket. That would be like your shoulder joint or your hip joint, where you have a head that fits into a cup, and that gives you movement in lots of planes. It gives you the most movement of all the types of joints. So let's look at the types of movement. We said when one surface slides or glides over another, that's a gliding movement, and that would be like your wrist bones if you were waving from side to side. Angular movements are going to be those that increase or decrease angles between two bones. For if I'm standing in anatomical position, my arms are to my side and they're extended out. But if I bring my lower arm up to my upper arm, I've decreased the angle between the two sets of bones, or I have flexed my arm. When I move it back down to anatomical position, I've extended my arm. So if you see this lady, she's moving her lower leg up, she's flexing it. In the second picture, she's moving it back down to anatomical position, she's extending it. In the first picture, she's decreasing the angle between her arm and her head, so she's flexing the entire arm. Then she extends it by bringing it back down to anatomical position. But look at that third picture, she's bringing it beyond anatomical position. We call that hyperextension. You can see her standing extended when she's standing straight up. She bends at the waist. She's flexing because we've decreased that angle. She goes extending back up to anatomical position, and then when she goes past anatomical position, she's hyperextending. That D picture shows you the same thing with only using the head. Flex, extend, hyperextend. Now look at the bottom E picture. If I take the bony part of my foot and pull it up towards the bony part of my shin, that's called dorsiflexion. And if I take my toes and I move them towards the plantar, you plant your foot firmly on the ground, or I point my toes, that is plantar flexion. If I move my arms away from my body, that is abduction. If I move my arms towards my body, that's adduction. I like to think I'm adding my arms back to my body. So when I add them back to my body, adduction. I can do it with my fingers. If I make my fingers spread wide apart, I've abducted. When I move them back together, I adduct. If I move the distal end, like she's moving her hand around in a circle, we call that circumduction. If a bone moves on its own axis, it's called rotation, like shaking your head no, or turning your hand from the back side to the front side, rotation. Special movements. If I turn a body to its ventral, let's say you're laying on your back and you turn to your belly, we call that pronation because now you're laying prone. And if you're on your belly and you move to your back or your spine, we call that supination because you're moving to a supine position, the supine. If you move your sole of your foot medial, you're turning it in, so it's inversion. If you move it lateral, you're turning it out, so it's eversion. If you do a non-angular movement to the front, like you jut your chin out, that's protraction. If you pull your chin back, it's retraction. You can also do that with your shoulder blades. If you roll your shoulders to the back, to the front, that's protraction. If you roll them around to the back, it's retraction. If you take your shoulders and you move them superior, you have elevated them. If you move them inferior, then it is depression. You can do that with your jaw as well. When you move your mouth up, elevation, your jaw up when you're talking, elevation. When you move it down, it's depression. If you take your thumb and move it to your fingers because of that saddle joint, you have an opposable thumb. You can manipulate your environment a lot better than any other animal. That's called opposition. And that concludes our notes on the skeletal system.